Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Dave. Thank you. I'd like to start by saying why, from an economic hitman's perspective, I think we're at war. Why we're doing what we're doing in the Middle East today, in Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, in Kuwait, and all over. Why this is happening, and by understanding that, how we must end it. You know, we see all these signs about getting rid of George Bush, but we all, I think, know that George Bush isn't really the problem. George Bush is certainly part of the problem, but this thing goes deeper than Democrats or Republicans. You know, we have to remember that it was John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson who really took us into Vietnam. They were Democrats. It's the corporatocracy. It's the people that run our big corporations. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that tonight to really try to get at the heart of this problem. And I'm not trying to forgive George Bush. I mean, I'm as upset as anybody is at what's going on today in this country. But to just think that that will do away with the problem by voting in somebody else isn't going to solve the problem. We've got to go deeper than that. And tonight, we're going to do that. I have a very strong conviction that when we leave here tonight, all of us, together we will be determined, you and I, to go out and do the right thing. And it's the pragmatic thing. It's the rational thing, and it's the patriotic thing. And we're going to turn this country around. We're going to turn the world around in that process. And we're going to create a world that my 24-year-old daughter and her children will be very happy to inherit. And that means that every child growing up today and in the future in Nigeria and in Indonesia and in the Philippines and in Iraq and in Bolivia and Ecuador and Mexico also will be happy about what's going to happen here tonight. The movement that we're going to get going on to change this country, because I believe that it's not that difficult. It's a challenge, but we're going to move forward with it. Before we get into that, though, I would just like to talk a little bit about, from my perspective as an economic hitman, what's really been going on in the history of this world in my lifetime, which really began at the end of World War II. I was born just before World War II ended in 1945. My dad was in the Navy at the time. He didn't see me until I was a year old because of World War II, because he was serving in the Navy. I didn't see him either till I was a year old. I don't remember that occasion, but he tells me he does. From my perspective, what we've been doing since the end of World War II is building an empire. And today we have managed to build the world's first truly global empire. It's the first in the history of the world. And it's also the first empire that's really been built without the military for the most part. It's been built through economics, through economic hitmen like me. The military has been there standing in the background, prepared to go in to serve us, to take care of things when we failed. But it's been essentially built through economics. And in the process of building this empire, let me go back. This empire is the first truly global one. We're unchallenged by any other superpower. We're challenged today by men and women with homemade bombs on their backs, but we're not challenged by any other empire today. And it's the first empire that hasn't been built primarily by the military. It's also the first empire without an emperor. And again, some of you may dispute that. you strong Democrats out there. But the fact of the matter is, instead of an empire, what we have today, and what's been growing stronger and stronger since World War II, is what I call the corporatocracy. And this is a fairly small group of mostly men who run our biggest corporations. And through them, they run our government and practically every other government in the world, all the important ones in the world. They are the equivalent of the empire. And they are in control regardless of whether we have a Republican or a Democrat in the White House or controlling Congress. They are in control. Certain things may be different with a Republican and a Democrat. For example, the the Supreme Court, people that are put on that. There's differences, but as far as building this empire is concerned, it continues under all those regimes, and this is what we must change. And so how do we economic hitmen work? Well, the most common way, and Dave just read a bit of that, is that we will identify a country, a third world country, that has resources that our corporations covet, like oil. And then we'll arrange a huge loan to that country from an organization like the World Bank. But this loan doesn't go to the country. Instead, it goes to U.S. corporations, Halliburton, Bechtel, Brown and Root, you know the names. Those are the ones that get the money. And they build big infrastructure projects in this country, power plants, ports, highways, industrial parks, things that benefit the very rich who are in collaboration with the corporatocracy, but they don't benefit the poor. The poor aren't connected to the power grids. They don't have the skills to get the jobs in the industrial parks. They don't own cars to drive on the highways or ships to use in the ports. The country's left holding a huge debt, so huge you can't possibly repay it. So at some time, we economic hitmen go back and say to the country, listen, you can't pay your debts, so give us a pound of flesh. Sell oil to our oil companies real cheap, or vote with us on the next critical United Nations vote, or send troops in support of ours to someplace in the world like Iraq. And in that way, we've built this empire. There's a lot of other things we've done, but that's the most common and most typical one. Sometimes we fail, not very often. I failed miserably in Panama with Omar Torrijos, I personally, and in Ecuador with Jaime Roldos. And I detail this in the books, but what happens then is what we call the jackals go in. The jackals overthrow governments, as we tried to do in 2002 with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, or they assassinate the leaders of these governments, as they did with Jaime Roldos in Ecuador and Omar Torrijos in Panama. I felt deeply guilty for that, because I particularly liked Torrijos, who I knew quite well personally, and I knew that if I failed to bring him around, the jackals were likely to step in, and they did. He died in a fiery airplane crash. I have no doubt it was a CIA orchestrated assassination done by jackals. On the few occasions when the jackals also fail, then, and only then, does the military go in. That's what happened in Iraq. To understand Iraq, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my perspective on Iraq in just a minute, but to really understand it, we first have to understand Saudi Arabia. A lot of you will remember, some of you won't. I'd like to see we get quite a generational mix here. In the early 70s, OPEC didn't like what we were doing in Israel. Same old story. And so they cut off our oil supplies. So some of you will remember these long lines at the gas stations. And we feared we were going to have another depression like the 1929 depression. And so the U.S. Treasury Department came to me and other economic hitmen and said, listen, you know, we can't allow OPEC to blackmail us anymore. You guys got to come up with a plan so this will never happen again. We knew that that plan had to involve Saudi Arabia because it had more oil than anybody else, and it also, the House of Saud, the royal family, was corrupt and corruptible. The long version is explained in the book, but the short version of what we did, the deal we finally struck with the House of Saud, was a deal whereby they would return almost all the money they made from selling oil to the United States, invested in U.S. government securities. The U.S. Treasury Department would use the interest from those securities, which over the years has amounted to trillions of dollars, to hire U.S. companies to westernize Saudi Arabia, build petrochemical complexes, desalinization plants, whole cities out of the desert, McDonald's and all the other things that go along with our Western culture. The House of Saud would also agree to keep the price of oil within limits acceptable to the oil companies. Possibly not acceptable to you and me, but acceptable to the oil companies. And this is very, very important. They agree that they would never, ever sell oil for anything other than U.S. dollars. This happened in the early 70s, right after we'd gone off the gold standard because we were bankrupt, because we could not pay off our debts to European countries in gold. Nixon took us off the gold standard. And then we were stuck with a situation as why will anybody in the world use dollars? So very shortly we came up with this plan, which in essence put the dollar on the oil standard. You cannot buy oil on the world market for anything other than dollars, and that's very important to the corporatocracy. Our part of the bargain was we agreed to keep the House of Saud in power, in control. It was an amazing deal, the deal of the century. It was history-making, incredibly powerful deal that we struck with Saudi Arabia, and it's held. It's had some what the CIA calls blowback, unintended consequences. For example, one of the things that really pisses Osama bin Laden off is those McDonald's and those desalinization plants and those petrochemical complexes surrounding Medina and Mecca, the two most sacred sites in Islam. And it pisses off a lot of other Muslims in Indonesia and all over the world. There's been some blowback, but on the whole, the corporatocracy looked at this as an incredible success. I had done my job. We economic hitmen did a great job with that one. So we decided that Saddam Hussein ought to accept something very similar. Now, probably a lot of you know that Saddam has been our boy for a very, very long time. You may remember Abdul Karim Qasim, who was president of Iraq in the early 60s. Qasim came up with a unique concept. He said, Iraqi oil ought to go to benefit the Iraqi people. How novel is that? But we didn't like that very much. He began to tax the oil companies, particularly the British and some American companies, and threatened to nationalize our oil companies. And so we decided that Qasim had to go. The CIA sent in an assassination team. It was headed by a man who was still going through high school, an Iraqi citizen who was still going through high school. They riddled Qasim's car with bullets on the streets of Baghdad and missed him. The head of this assassination team was wounded and fled to Syria. His name was Saddam Hussein. He was a CIA agent in those days, an assassin for us. He failed. And so the CIA went directly, and this is all history, I'm not creating this. CIA went in and had Qasim publicly executed on Iraqi television. They put Saddam's cousin in charge. He became president of Iraq, and Saddam became vice president in charge of security. Eventually, as you know, he became president. He was our boy. He was our man. And so, and we sold him a lot of, and gave him a lot of tanks. We built him, Bechtel built him big chemical, I ought to know, my father-in-law was chief architect at Bechtel, built Saddam big chemical plants that were used, and we knew that they were used to make mustard gas and other chemical weapons that were being employed against the Kurds and later the Iranians. We knew this, but we sold him these things. And in the 1980s, we decided that Saddam Hussein ought to accept something similar to Saudi Arabia. It was such a successful deal, because after all, what we want to do is control the Middle East and control the oil in the Middle East. And incidentally, I'm going to get back to Iraq in just a moment. But for those of you who think that Israel is about creating a homeland for the Jewish people, you're as deceived as most of them are. It's partly about that, perhaps, but what it's really about is creating a surrogate fortress in the middle of the Middle East. The Israelis are being used as pawns. They're being used like old armies used to use sheep that ran before the armies. They're our surrogates. And their leadership knows that. Most Israelis probably don't. They think they're creating a homeland. But it's a very, very sad situation of what's going on there. And of course, the Lebanese and the Palestinians are caught in the middle of this. And Iraq is part of that too. We have to remember that Middle Eastern oil is the oil that's used by a great deal of Europe and China and Japan. If we control Middle Eastern oil, we control our biggest potential competitors, Japan, China, Europe. So it's very important that we do that. So in the 80s, we decided that Saddam ought to accept the same sort of deal that the Saudis had accepted. The economic hitmen went in and did their job on him, but he wouldn't buy. He'd been our man, but he wouldn't buy. If he had, he'd still be president of Iraq, and we'd be selling him all the tanks and fighter jets and all the chemical plants he wants. But he wouldn't buy. So we sent in the jackals. They couldn't take him out. His security was very good, and he had many doubles, many lookalikes. Now, in the case of both Roldos and Torrijos, the way we assassinate presidents like that, well, let me ask you a question. If you're the president of a country and you're surrounded by men with AK-47s and other heavy armaments, your bodyguards, and somebody wants to assassinate you, who's the most likely candidate to be your assassin? Your bodyguards, particularly if they happen to be trained at the School of the Americas. And Roldos' and Torrijos' bodyguards were trained at the School of the Americas. Almost all of them were. Now, we all know that men like that, trained in those schools, are usually pretty loyal to their trainers, their mentors. They were also very underpaid. And so, for example, in the case of Torrijos, what we did was go up to one of his bodyguards, sent his teacher from the School of the Americas to a couple of his bodyguards who were making about $10,000 a year. And the mentors went in, the teachers went in and said, look, you know, you'd be doing this country a great service if you get rid of this man, this Torrijos. You've got to get him out of here. And incidentally, here's $100,000. You're only making $10,000 a year, so this is a pretty good deal. We could do that. In the case of Iraq, Saddam had been our man. He had been our assassin. He knew our ways. He knew how to protect himself. He had damn good security and all these look-alike doubles. Now, what's the stupidest thing you can do if you're bodyguard to a president? Shoot his double. And if you never know who you're guarding and somebody offers you a high price to shoot somebody and you don't even know who you're guarding, you're probably not going to do it, because by God, if you shot Saddam's double, you and your family and everybody else you ever ran into on the streets, life wouldn't be worth much, would it? So we couldn't take him out. So in '91 we sent in the military, our military, and some of you people were there. We could have taken Saddam out at that time, and I think you who were there probably know that better than anybody else. But we didn't want to. Saddam was the type of man the corporatocracy likes. The strong man, could keep his people under control. He could keep the Iranians under control on their borders pretty well. He could keep the Kurds under control. We thought that when we took out his military, he would be sufficiently chastised that now he would buy our deal. So the economic hitmen went back to work on him in the 90s. Couldn't bring him around again, though. Again, if they had, he'd still be there. The assassins couldn't take him out again. So once again, the military went in. And they're still there. Of course, if we'd struck that deal with him, we would be building, our Bechtels and Halliburtons would be building huge cities there and petrochemical complexes, just like they've done in Saudi Arabia. And of course, that's what they're doing there now, too, in a different way. But that's what this is all about. That's what these wars are about. From my perspective, that's what Iraq is about. Iraq is a classic case of failure on the part of economic hitmen and jackals. And when we fail, you guys go in to do the job. Well, I don't want to spend too much time on the bad news here. This is all the bad news. The good news is that we have reached a point in history today where we know that we live on a very, very small planet. There can be no question about this. It's a very tiny planet. We are one community. And we know, I know, that my daughter and her children cannot grow up in a stable, a sane, a sustainable, peaceful world unless every child in every country in the most remote corners of this planet also has that expectation. We all know this. It's become very, very clear to us. The conquistadores never had to worry about the Incas attacking Madrid. The Spanish and the French never had to worry about the tribal peoples of Africa and Asia attacking Paris and London. We know we're vulnerable. Our airplanes apparently were under attack yesterday in London. We've seen what happened in New York and Washington, and regardless of which theory you believe, we know something terribly tragic happened on those days. We know we're very vulnerable. We know that the most powerful, most well-financed army in the world can essentially be brought to its knees by people with homemade bombs strapped to their backs. We know we live in a very small world. We also know that today we have all the resources that we need to create a better world. 24,000 people die every single day from poor food, starvation, or hunger-related diseases. 24,000 people died on 9/11 from hunger. 24,000 people died today from hunger. But it doesn't have to happen. We have all the resources we need to change that. And that is the cause of so many of these problems, the fact that we've created a world where there's so much desperation, where there's so much poverty and anger and so much fear around the world. But we can change that, and that's the good news. And I want to talk a little bit about what we have to do to make that happen, and I don't really think it's that difficult. But before I do that, I just want to touch, having done a little bit on Saudi Arabia and Iraq, I want to talk a bit about South America. Having done a little bit on Saudi Arabia and Iraq, I want to talk a bit about South America. Because I think today, what's going on in South America is amazingly significant. Viva los latinos y las latinas. Viva. 7 countries in South America representing over 80% of the population of South America, 300 million out of 360 million people in the last elections voted in the president who ran specifically on an anti-corporatocracy campaign. Now, I want to tell you that these people are not anti-American. I speak Spanish fluently. I spend a lot of time in Latin America all the time. I have 3 godchildren who live in Latin America. I was there as a Peace Corps volunteer in the late 60s. And I can tell you that any one of you goes to any one of these 7 countries and the people there will welcome you with open arms. And they love what this country represents, despite what our president says about people hating democracy. I don't know anybody that does. They love our Declaration of Independence. They love our ideals. They hate having our corporations exploit their resources. They can't stand that. What Bolivia wants is not cocaine. That's an absurdity. What Bolivia wants is to have its natural gas be used, the revenues from its natural gas be used to help pull its poorest people up by their bootstraps. What Ecuador wants is for its oil to be used to help its poor people. That's what Venezuela wants, and Brazil wants to have its Amazon rainforest used to help its people and all of its other resources, and the same for Chile and Uruguay. All of these countries, what they are objecting to is the corporatocracy. It isn't you and me. It isn't the American way. They love this, but they can't stand to have their resources exploited by us. They're not asking us to help them. They're not asking for foreign aid. In fact, you know, Chavez just helped Bolivia pay off all of its debts to the IMF. It's nice to be with enthusiastic people. So they've sent us a very, very strong message, an incredibly strong message. I am so taken by what's going on in South America today, these democratic movements. And isn't it interesting that in our own country, in the United States of America, in recent history, the only people that have really organized and taken to the streets and protested have been the Latinos. They understand democracy. But I want to tell you what happens to these presidents in South America. And I can tell you this as a fact because after Confessions of an Economic Hitman was written, a lot of people came out of the shadows, other economic hitmen and jackals and others, and talked to me and told me their stories. And their stories are going in the book I'm working on now, as well as they're pretty amazing. I kind of like some of my stories, but wait till you read theirs. Puts me to shame. And I talked to a couple of them who've done what I'm going to describe for you right now in the last few years. Every one of these presidents, when he's taken office, or she in the case of Chile, when he or she has taken office, someone like me, someone with my old job, economic hitman, walks into that office. And this is someone the president knows, seen around, maybe works for the World Bank or a private consulting firm. He's been around, he speaks Spanish, or she maybe. And that person walks into the president's office and says, "Mr. President," or Ms. President in the case of Bachelet of Chile. So the president walks in and says, the economic hitman walks in and says, "Congratulations, Mr. President. And now, I just want to remind you that," and he speaks in a pretty soft voice at this point, "I just want to remind you that in this pocket over here, I got a couple of $100 million for you and your family. Couple of $100 million if you play the game our way. And in this pocket, I got a gun with a bullet. It's got your name on it, in case you decide to keep your campaign promises." Every one of these presidents has had that experience. Chavez has been writing about it and speaking about it. He's read my book and invited me down there, and he's got some amazing speeches where he talks about the economic hitmen and the jackals that have come to him. In the case of Ecuador, Gutierrez was elected president. He ran on a very strong anti-oil campaign, anti-corporatocracy campaign, and the people, and I know Ecuador really well, that's where my godchildren are. And I was there at the time, and he won with a pretty good majority on this anti-corporatocracy platform. He was visited by one of these men, I know who, and within a month he was in Washington, D.C., and when he came back, people were plastering pictures up all over the walls of Quito and Guayaquil with pictures of Gutierrez holding hands with George Bush. George likes to hold hands with a lot of men. Have you noticed that? And he began to cut real sweet deals with the oil companies. And he began to implement the conditionalities that the IMF and the World Bank wanted him to pose upon his people. The people took to the streets. They were infuriated. They had elected this guy, and he's gone against his campaign promises, and they kicked him out. He had to flee to Brazil. Now, my phone was ringing off the hook that day. My Ecuadorian friends were calling me and saying, "You know, in a democratic country like Ecuador, when you vote a man in who runs on a certain campaign platform, and he doesn't keep it, he goes against everything he ran on, democracy demands that you throw him out of office." In a democratic country like Ecuador, when you vote a man in who runs on a certain campaign platform, and he doesn't keep it, he goes against everything he ran on, democracy demands that you throw him out of office. Why don't you guys do the same thing? I don't know. I said, maybe we're not a democracy. So all over South America, this is what's going on now, and we're seeing the repercussions in many countries, actually. And what I want to say to you is, put yourself in the position of that president. Imagine if you had run on a campaign that you deeply believe in, of keeping down the corporatocracy, of using your country's resources to help your people, and you're voted in, and somebody walks into your office and says something like that to you. Now, that's usually said more subtly. It's not quite as dramatic as I put it, but because I've said that to people like that. And what we really say at that point is, hey, remember what happened to Arbenz of Guatemala? Remember what happened to Allende of Chile? Remember what happened to Roldos? Remember what happened to Lumumba in the Congo? Remember what happened to Diem in Vietnam? Remember what happened to Torrijos? Remember what happened to Noriega? Remember, remember, remember. They get the message. What would you do if you'd just been elected president of one of these countries and someone like me walks into your office and gives you this ultimatum? Here's a lot of money for you and your family, or we can throw you out of office. And you know damn well that if you get thrown out of office or assassinated, the next guy's going to be scared shitless. What's he going to do? So what are you going to do when that happens? What would you do? It's a hard question to answer, isn't it? So what has to happen here is it's you and me who have to do something. It's us here in this country. We can't let that happen anymore. We must defend democracy. And even if we don't like what those democratically elected presidents are saying, and I don't like what some of them are saying, I'm not a real big fan of some of those presidents and their economic policies, I got to tell you that. But I 100% support them as long as they're elected democratically. And most every one of them has been elected by a much greater majority with a much greater percentage of their population voting than happened in this country. They are truly democratically elected presidents. And I don't care what CNN says about, or Fox or anybody else about Chavez. He has won plurality after plurality after vote. He keeps winning. And so we must send a message to our government and to our corporations, to the corporatocracy, that they have to respect democracy. Not just any president, whether he's a democratically elected president or a dictator who happens to support our corporate policies. We must stand behind our principles. One of the other things that's happened in the history of this country during my lifetime, as we've built this empire, is that we have managed to subjugate, to put aside, to sweep under the rug every principle that I grew up believing was what makes America great. And we need to turn that around. The very things that you all joined the military to fight to support, we've managed to subjugate, and we need to change that. So let's talk about how we can do that. Let's move on to the good news. And again, the good news is we know we live on a very, very small planet. We know we have all the resources we need to make this a better world, and that the only way our children are going to grow up safe, secure, and in a sustainable world is that if every child in the world has that opportunity. Right now, we represent 5% of the world's population. We consume over 25% of its resources and create more than 30% of its pollution. And the only thing you can say about a system like that is it is a failure. You cannot take that system to India or China or Africa or South America. It doesn't work. Do the math. 5% of the world's population consuming 25% of its resources and contributing over 30% of its pollution. That is a failed system. We have to change it. We know from history that empires never survive. They always collapse. And when they collapse, a void is created. And more wars happen. and then a new empire emerges, which usually isn't any better than the last and could be an awful lot worse. I sure don't want to see my daughter have to wear a veil. I'm not looking to have the Chinese run my country or anybody else. What we must do this time is something that's never been done in history before. We must turn this empire into something new, something different. We must create a new model. So let's not watch the empire collapse. Let's instead transform it. Let's transform it into something that represents the ideals that our founding fathers envisioned when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, and that so many men and women over the centuries have died for in defending. So many of your brothers and sisters in the military have died to defend those principles. So let's turn this country into something that truly represents those principles and take that out to the world as a model. The way we can do this, and the way we must do this, is to go after the power base of the corporatocracy. Please continue working in politics, those of you who do. Continue moving in that avenue, but recognize that unless we change these corporations, that only has some limited benefits. If we want to really change the system, we've got to go after the emperor. And the emperor is not in politics. The emperor is controlling the money. That's the big corporations. These corporations today have one goal. And that goal is to make a few rich men a lot richer. We need to change that so that the goal now becomes one of primarily serving all the employees, even after retirement, through health benefits, etc. Serving their customers, of course. Serving their customers and also serving the people who provide the raw materials that go into those corporations, whether those people live in Ethiopia or in Indonesia or in Uruguay. Taking care of the people that provide the resources and taking care of all the communities and the environments where all of these people live. In other words, these corporations need to become good citizens. They need to become good moral communities. They are our main communities. Most of us look at a globe of the earth and we see all these countries outlined on it, about 200 of them, slightly less, and many of those countries were created by us, by the colonial powers, sort of arbitrarily. But most of those countries don't really impact any other countries, with some obvious exceptions like us. But most of them don't impact other countries. And in any case, thinking of that globe as the geopolitics of this planet is archaic. The real geopolitics of this planet could better be viewed as a bunch of huge clouds that move around this planet, and those clouds are the big corporations. And they really run the geopolitics of this planet. Of the 100 largest economies in the world, 51 are corporations, not governments, and 47 of those are US based. These are the entities that control the planet. And so we must change those corporations. We must bring them around. They will tell you, and all of our governments will tell you, that every country out there that we're working with ought to be a democracy and ought to be transparent. And I think that's a pretty good idea. But what about the corporations? Every corporation should be democratic and transparent. What we have today is what I call imperialistic capitalism, where a few men make all the decisions and most all the money. What we need to move into is democratic capitalism, which will be much more egalitarian, which in fact represents what our Declaration of Independence